Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. We're going to be talking about the reuse of materials in design and architecture and a tour of a green home with my guest, Stephen Pallrand. He is the founding designer and ecopreneur of Carbon Shack. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Your company in the Mount Washington area of Los Angeles is very involved in using materials that might have been thrown away for the design of furniture and other needed items in our home. How do you decide what to use and what not to use?
There's two things when you're looking at lowering your carbon footprint in the way we live or work in our shelters or our buildings. There's the operational carbon footprint, which is the day-to-day carbon cost of heating the water, heating the air, cooling the air, all of that. Then there's the embodied carbon footprint, which is the one-time cost of building or making something. So what we want to do is, a lot of people look at the operational carbon footprint, but less people have been looking at the embodied carbon footprint. We need to look at how we make things more as we try to become more sustainable and lower our overall carbon footprint. It's really just that approach in thinking about how, when I'm making something, how do I lower my carbon footprint that has come out of this whole endeavor. I mean, we started by reusing framing material in our new construction. So we would take buildings apart that were going to be demolished, and we would reuse that material in our new buildings, our new construction.
And we call that deconstruction, and it should be happening more than having buildings torn down and stuff going into the landfills.
It's absolutely a shame. Now, actually, in Oregon, that's the one place where they have a building code that requires you, when you're taking a building apart built before 1940, you have to deconstruct it because, as you and I know, buildings built before that time are built with dense old-grain Douglas fir and redwood. This is very valuable material that you can't get anymore. So it's a shame to, one, throw it out, and the other side of it is that when you take something to the dump, wood to the dump, and it decomposes, it actually produces more climate harmful gases than if you wood chip that same material and spread it around your property. Of course, it's less harmful if you reuse it. So the thing is that we're just not used to reusing things, and so we're just used to taking buildings apart and throwing them in the dump, which we should not be doing. We should be reusing all that material.
You certainly believe in environmental stewardship via design and build, from the foundation of a home to the interiors. And I think quite often when we talk about green homes, we're talking about energy efficiency and air quality, but it's so much more than that, as you have shown with having the building materials be from reused materials, from having the interior design, couches and desks and beds and everything else be from reused material.
Yeah, well, we were building this one case study house, and it was a house that we started about 7 years ago. We took a building apart in Pico Union, and we brought the lumber up, and we were building this new construction out of it. We were using heat pump hot water heaters, which at the time nobody had heard of, heat pumps to heat and cool the air, solar array, all electric house. And it was this amazing story of lowering the embodied and the operational carbon footprint. But what we realized is that that whole story was trapped behind the walls. The wood, the heat pump to heat and cool the air was in the basement. The heat pump hot water heater was outside. The solar array was on the roof. You didn't live with any of the story of environmental stewardship. And that's where my wife, she's an artist who works at the intersection of art and science, she always wanted to uncover the nature in which we live in our homes. So that began the idea of like, hey, let's take this story of environmental stewardship of the building and the way we build and live into the finishes. So then we brought that concept into the furniture, the drapery, the tiles and everything like that, so that you're living with that story. It's not just out of sight, out of mind behind the walls, but that the tables are reused lumber, or the cabinetry is made out of framing cutoffs from the framing process, or there's a tree that is taken down in the inner city for one reason or falls down, and we reuse that lumber. So it's all that story of environmental stewardship we wanted to bring into the daily experience of the people who live in the homes, because if you're not living with that story, you sort of forget about it.
Your company seems to incorporate artisans craftspeople, architects, designers working together. Is that the wave of the future, to not just have people focused on one aspect of building and design?
Design is not just about the concept, but it's about the execution. And that's what we do in this company, is we bring the execution, the craftsmanship into the design. It's the implementation of design. Frank Lloyd Wright was great, but his designs, each choice that designer makes, each choice that craftsman makes when they're executing the design is almost as important as the designer's concept.
We've been talking about architecture, interior design, but how does art get involved in all of this?
Well, that's my wife who brought that to the table. As I mentioned, she works at the intersection of art and science. So her creativity, we began to look at nature for these creative motifs and creative interactions. And that's how we came up with our tile designs, fabric designs, and things like that. So we used mycelium as one of the great examples, because mycelium is the wood wide web, the way trees trade resources, and that's such an important part of the ecosystem. So we created a design out of the mycelium inspiration of mycelium. Then we have this design, which then we used in fabric and the carving and tile, and we create a lot of beautiful patterns.
And I've certainly seen some of those beautiful designs. You live the talk, because I visited your home. It was gorgeous and incredibly beautiful with all this reused material. Could you describe it?
That's the other thing I also want to make a point of, is that we think about living green as like living in a yurt with an outhouse or something. But the point we want to make is that living green is not only sustainable, but it's not about sacrificing. It's about living with beauty and living in comfort. So that was the goal at that home, was to make a case study proof of beautiful, gorgeous patterns on hemp fabric, wood that is parquet floors that are made from wood that would have been thrown out, cabinets that were made from church pews that a church was throwing in the dump, and we salvaged them and we made beautiful cabinetry and tables out of them. The thing is that with the challenge is that when you're reusing material, I mean, it's sort of easy to build new construction. It's easy to build new things. What's hard is that when you're given a pile of salvage material, that's where the creativity comes into play. How do I creatively make something beautiful out of this pile of stuff that I'm given? Not something that I requested. I went to the catalog and identified what I want, but no, I'm given this pile of material. How do I creatively reuse this in a way that is about beauty? That was the challenge.
What was your biggest challenge in reusing material in your design and construction and interior materials, and what was the easiest item to incorporate?
In some sense, the easiest item was the salvaged church pews, because we have a gentleman on staff, a tradesman. We have a company of architects, interior designers, and also tradespeople. We are sort of full service in that way. And the beauty of that is it's not just about design, but design is really just lines on paper. But once the lines on paper become a tradesman or a craftsman actually working with the material, that's when a lot of the creativity happens. So that's what's great about our company, is we integrate that full service into the way we design. So we have a gentleman on staff who's a wood carver. So the church pews, we got those, and we're like, oh, what can we do with those? And he said, well, this is actually the best wood to carve with. So then we took our designs, our mycelium designs and things like that, and we made these beautiful tables and chairs and furniture, which he hand carved, and they're absolutely gorgeous work. That was a fun, sort of easy outcome of some of the salvage material. The biggest challenge, I think, that everybody should know about using salvage material is when framing, is that a lot of the framing lumber comes from the period before they would grade lumber. Nowadays, everybody knows that when you buy lumber, it comes with a stamp. That means the lumber has been graded for a certain use. And so the lumber that comes out of these older homes that's salvage is pre-grading system, and you have to actually have a grader come out and individually assess each piece of lumber. It sounds like a burden. What they do is they just actually individually stamp each piece, but if you have a huge pile, which we do, then it can be very efficient. We just have him come for a day, and we just shuffle the lumber in front of him. He stamps it, and he's just stamping all day long. That's sort of the challenge, but it is actually a very cost-effective challenge.
If you want to do something right, you have to be willing to take a little bit of extra time and be able to incorporate your beliefs in sustainability into reality.
But the beauty is it's not extra cost, because what we did is we took a house apart, used those parts in our new construction, and we proved that we actually did not spend any more money than buying the material new. So taking the house apart, reusing that stuff, and not buying new material, actually, it did not cost more.
It's an important point that being ecological is no longer more expensive. And in the long term, it is much less expensive and healthier for the environment. We know that there are certification programs for building homes and offices and schools, structures to make them green and sustainable. Is there any kind of certification program for people reusing materials?
No, there isn't currently. As I mentioned, in Oregon, they have a code where that's required, but there is no certification. In our practice, we don't use the certifications, because the problem with certifications is it's often a high bar for people to achieve, and what we're trying to do is bring people along. If we can only bring people along 10% of the way towards LEED Platinum, if we can only bring them along 60% of the way towards passive home, that's good enough. If you can't get 100% and get your LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, or passive house, that should not prevent people from getting farther along that road to being more sustainable. If you can only change out your hot water heater to a heat pump hot water heater, you don't get LEED Platinum, you don't get certification, but you did a good thing. And we don't want to discourage people from doing incremental changes, progressive changes, because they're not being perfect or they're not orthodox.
Extremely important point that we don't have to aim for the certification. We can just do what is important and what is possible. Explain the name of your company, Carbon Shack.
I guess it's sort of a whimsical use of terms. Our shacks, our shelters, our homes, our structures are about carbon consumption. The idea was to make the name of our company about consciousness of the carbon costs of the way we live and the choices we make.
You also have to work with city, county, state regulations, district regulations, policies by utility companies to be able to overcome some old standards that really are not promoting sustainability. I'm thinking, of course, of using gray water systems.
Yes, it's true. We're a small company, so it's difficult because we have less impact than the larger, like lumber corporations on the code and things like that. We're more trying to skirt around the edges and get things done. Some of the reason why we don't reuse lumber is because the lumber industry doesn't really want to promote that, which is a shame.
And that is something that activists need to work on to get the lumber companies and others to incorporate these very principles that we're talking about.
Or get your Office of Sustainability in the municipality you're in to look at, with the Department of Building Safety, these reuse codes.
Like you, I have grown up enjoying the natural environment. I have an historic home, and I believe that we need to have better kinds of architecture, designs of cities that incorporate nature. You have a story of growing up in the Glen Falls, Upper New York area. Your families were there since the 1700s. How did that influence you?
Actually, part of my family came on the Mayflower. Actually, my name's Steve. It's Stephen. I was named after my dad's uncle. My dad grew up in this Glen Falls, which at the time was a center of the wood and textile industry at the south end of the Adirondacks. So a lot of lumber and paper pulp and industry came from the Adirondacks into Glens Falls. So Glens Falls was sort of the industrial hub of that upper New York State area. So my dad grew up in a very urban environment, and he had an uncle who lived in the Adirondacks in the backcountry and was basically, we would call it a subsistence farmer. He had no need of the outside world. He grew everything and completely was self-sustaining. And my dad just loved that and was fascinated by that. His Uncle Stevie, my great uncle, canned everything. They had trout in the fish pond. They had an outhouse. They used the manure as fertilizer. You know, it was a complete circular economy in the old traditional subsistence farmer way. So my dad named me after Uncle Steve, and I guess that name had a lot of influence because I came around professionally working basically with the circular economy and environmental minimalism.
I'm so glad that you have adopted some of those traditional ideas and moved into the modern technological era to incorporate sustainability in your work and encouraging others others to do so. Thank you so very much for your activities and providing these resources. Thank you for being my guest.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I have been speaking with Stephen Pallrand, who is the founding designer and ecopreneur of Carbon Shack. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.